Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to continue with the unit on ethics, and let's start with an ethical dilemma, very relevant one right now. So, as of April 27th, U.S. unemployment now stands at over 26 million. You can see the massive, massive spike once the coronavirus pandemic hit. So, we've seen already historic federal bailout packages, yet clearly still much more has to be done. We've seen some of the curves flattening, perhaps, although there is certainly some prediction that we're going to have a second wave and a lot of hesitation about reopening the economy. However, some states and some countries are starting to reopen right now. So it kind of begs the question, is this the right thing to do? So, of course, in TOK, we're going to ask, how could we find a defensible answer? What is safe to assume when trying to answer this question? So, to go back, let's look at a meta-ethical question. We talked about meta-ethics last time, and I would ask you, do your religious beliefs actually guide your answer on this question about reopening the economy in the midst of this crisis? Do you have faith in something that's beyond maybe the science and the data that is actually guiding how you might conceive of what the right thing to do is in this situation? Should you, as many of the leaders have said, trust in and be guided by the science and the data? What would that conclusion look like? That might not be so obvious either, but of course, we might meta-ethically ask the question, should we even trust in science and data to begin with? And then, of course, you might actually ask, is there some kind of human rights issue to consider, one way or the other? Maybe economic rights and liberties, as compared to the right to safety and life, or the rights to health care that might be in danger by reopening the economy. So, here's where normative ethics might be useful. What normative ethics try to do is question what theories and methods and try to develop systems in order to guide our ethical decision making in these difficult kinds of dilemmas. So this is actually the focus of most of ethical theory, most of the ink that's been spilled on the philosophy of ethics throughout the history of Western civilization has been about trying to develop guidelines that apply in a multitude of different situations and circumstances. It seems like most cultures around the world share some kind of version of the golden rule of trying to do unto others what you would have them do unto you. And you can see this if you actually have the textbook at home and you want to check out on page 259, there are actually examples of this that span throughout multiple cultures. So, one interesting question is, why be good? And how should you think about this kind of decision making? And that might lead you to a question about who's most important. Some normative systems are going to focus on the moral agent, the person actually making the decision about what the right thing is. Some moral systems are going to focus on the choice itself, the actual action or the intention, and how to actually decide rightness or wrongness in that context. Some are going to focus on the impacts of the choice, the consequences. And some might focus on the social context, how it actually interacts with society and social contracts. This actually kind of gives us our Mount Rushmore of ethical theories here, although these philosophers don't exactly line up. This is Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. They don't actually line up with these systems. But anyway, the four systems align with different kinds of normative focus. So we'll take a look at virtue ethics, which focuses on the agent of action, a kind of consequentialist utilitarian system, which is going to focus on, of course, the consequences, the results of actions. The contractarian theory, which focuses on the agreements made in society, and deontological theory, which is going to focus on maxims or ethical rules that cannot be broken, the actions themselves. So the oldest one comes out of ancient Greece. When we talk about virtue ethics, what does it mean to be virtuous? Well, this emphasizes the role of your character and what kind of character traits you think embody ethical behavior. Aristotle argued that to be a virtuous person, you want to aim for a golden mean between extremes in both your attitudes and behaviors. He also thought this was a pretty lofty goal. It was kind of hard to achieve. You needed some luck, you needed some wealth, you needed some status, good looks, friends, all these kinds of things to really live a great virtuous life. It's actually where we get the word aristocrat from, the person who lives kind of at the height of society. You can see some examples here. We'll let you pause this and look at this yourself. But if you look at attitudes here, like your attitude towards self, the middle is what you want to strive for: proper self-love, proper pride, and self-respect. A deficiency in attitude towards self would be servile, being servile to other people, and self-deprecation, putting yourself down. On the other side, we have arrogance and egoism, narcissism. So anyway, look these over. Again, here are some more examples of Aristotelian kinds of questions, like attitude towards our own desires. You might see some tough words in here. On one side, you might have anhedonia. You might not enjoy pleasure and restrict yourself from pleasure. On the other side, you're gluttonous and lustful, and you just want pleasure all the time. And of course, we want to shoot for the golden mean right in the middle. Another system that's very, very common and famous and studied in ethics is called deontology, or duty-based ethics. This says that we can come up with universal moral principles based on moral reasoning. This is basically the essential basis of human rights, of universal human rights. And the assumption is that there is a fundamental human dignity, that no person should be treated as a means to an end. Every person is an end in and of themselves. Some of the mechanisms that we use to figure out rightness in this situation might be a kind of version of the golden rule: moral imagination. Imagine yourself on the reverse end, reversibility as it might be called. Do unto others only as you're prepared to have them do unto you. So imagine yourself on the receiving end of actions. And the universability test. Don't do something unless you're prepared to have everybody do it all the time. What would the world look like if everyone did it all the time? Another way of thinking about this might be with these three maxims. All actions must be able to be made into universal laws. So think of yourself as being the universal legislator. Every human being must be treated as an end rather than a means, and you must always behave as if you were the absolute moral authority of the entire universe. Pretty heavy responsibility with all your actions, but basically behave based on your principles, not on the results of your actions, necessarily. Now, the social contract theory emphasizes rights and responsibilities in the context of community. If we are left out in a state of nature, it's brutally violent, and we don't want that. So we agree to sacrifice some of our liberty to come into a community. And therefore, we consent to have restrictions on ourselves. But then we have obligations, because if you have rights without responsibility, they're kind of meaningless. You could have the right to freedom of speech. If I have no responsibility to listen to you, well, your right doesn't really mean a whole lot. Another one that's actually kind of more common and is used in a lot of decision making is a consequentialist approach, or the fancy philosophical system is called utilitarianism. Now, this argues that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by the amount of pleasure or pain it creates. Later on, it is refined to reflect the amount of happiness, which may be a little bit more complicated than just pure pleasure. But the pleasure principle, it was developed by the original utilitarian thinker Jeremy Bentham, a lawyer greatly admired by Abraham Lincoln, and a very famous professor in England when all was said and done. And he argued that we should act to create the greatest good for the greatest number in society. Now, you may think that this is biased, and it certainly can be. It may be vulnerable to a kind of tyranny of the majority, but it also creates a kind of equality. Bentham argued that women should have equal consideration. He was one of the first thinkers to do this because he said they feel pleasure and pain like other beings. He was one of the first animal rights advocates by advocating that we create needless suffering in animal populations, that it doesn't create any kind of utility, it doesn't create any kind of pleasure. So there is a kind of equality that comes out of being reduced to a number, albeit perhaps dehumanizing in some contexts. All right, so let's look at a classical ethical dilemma that you might see in a kind of introduction to philosophy class. And let's say you can, or a Doctor Who episode, or a whole bunch of other TV shows, I'm sure have been about this. But let's say you've been able to travel back to 1931 and you have the chance to assassinate Adolf Hitler, potentially preventing 40 to 60 million deaths. What is the morally right thing to do? How would a deontologist evaluate this dilemma versus a utilitarian? Would a deontologist be able to justify murdering another person to potentially save 40 million people, potentially prevent a world war? What might your thoughts be about this? Let me just mention briefly, very briefly, several other approaches to normative ethics. The existentialists that came out of France in the 1950s and 60s argued that we should think about morality in a very individualistic way, that an individual should not be defined by any kind of essence, what country you're born into, what gender you're born into, what race or ethnicity you're born into, that essentially you have total freedom to design your own ethics and your own self. You just have to live with the consequences of your actions, but you can always control your attitudes. And that was a kind of radical freedom that really changed a lot of perspectives on morality. Going way, way, way back, it's probably not in such a great order, but anyway, a much earlier system from ancient Greece, from the thinker Epicurus, argued that pleasure was ultimately the goal of human life, and we would call this hedonism. That which maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain is morally good. So if it feels good, you should do it. As long as it doesn't hurt anybody, go for it. And that's a kind of hedonistic attitude that is pretty common in a lot of people. Now, another interesting moral perspective could be called a meta-ethical perspective, but can actually be considered as sort of normative system, that morality depends upon social approval. This is a more kind of current version of contractarianism, that if there's a social approval of a majority in your community, there is no inherent right or wrong, and it's kind of defined on the people that you're around. And of course, this has led a lot of people to think about cultural imperialism, question just what it means and how moral it actually is to try to impose one cultural set of norms on another culture. Another version of utilitarianism that's quite interesting came about through John Stuart Mill, who argued that we should try to use utilitarianism as a guideline to create rules in society. So don't just evaluate actions in a vacuum, but try to create rules for the greatest good. And that would actually solve some of the problems of utilitarianism itself. Very popular American ethical system, very popular in the early 20th century into the mid-20th century, was ethical pragmatism. This guided Franklin Delano Roosevelt and many other thinkers like John Dewey, who gave us the Dewey Decimal System, by the way, who was also a great political sociological thinker. They argued that norms, principles, and moral criteria can be improved as a result of inquiry and scientific testing, that we should try to strive to get gradually better with everything using science and innovation. So a kind of progressivism even in ethics. And then, of course, there's a kind of religious systems of ethics that vary tremendously. A couple other controversial approaches, running out of time here. I mentioned Machiavelli, and he argued that actions done for the good of family or country are morally justified, sometimes even if the actions themselves are immoral. And that is often problematic, but the way a lot of people think about things. Rational self-interest or ethical egoism says that action should be taken in the interest of self, and that selfish is not as evil as often characterized. So, at first glance, do any of these ethical perspectives connect with you and how you define yourself? So I'm going to ask you to post about on Edmodo today. Also, what do you think the ethical ideas of the IB are? And how does this all interact with your CAS project? Have you ever thought about that? Interested to hear your thoughts.